The nurse handed me the billing notice on a Tuesday morning while I was still hooked to the machine. $2,400. That's what the cancer clinic needed by Friday, or my third round of chemotherapy would be postponed indefinitely. My oncologist had been clear about what indefinitely meant for stage 2 colorectal cancer. I folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I called my son. He answered on the second ring, which surprised me. I could hear the office noise behind him, keyboards, someone laughing, the particular hum of a place that costs money to exist in. He'd just moved his company into new offices on Bay Street in Toronto. 32nd floor. I'd seen the photos on LinkedIn because he hadn't invited me to the opening. "Dad, hey, what's up?" I told him about the $2,400. I told him about Friday. I told him what postponing treatment would mean. I kept my voice steady the way you learn to do after 31 years teaching high school math in Sudbury. You get very good at delivering bad news without flinching. There was a pause on his end. Not a thinking pause. The kind of pause someone makes when they're deciding how to say something they've already decided. "Dad, the timing is really bad right now. We just closed our Series B. Every dollar is already committed to the runway. I can't pull personal funds right now without triggering a clause in the shareholder agreement." A shareholder agreement. My son was explaining shareholder agreements to me while I sat in a chemotherapy chair with a needle in my arm. I said, "It's $2,400. "I know what it is, Dad. I'm not in a position right now." "Can you talk to the hospital about a payment plan?" Then someone said his name in the background, a woman's voice, sharp and important sounding, and he said, "Hold on 1 second," and I listened to 30 seconds of muffled conversation about something called a term sheet. And then he came back and said, "Dad, I really have to go. I'll call you this weekend. We'll figure something out." The line went quiet. I sat in that chair for another 2 hours with the machine doing what my body couldn't do on its own anymore. And I stared at the muted television on the wall. And I thought about the summer my son was 9 years old and fell off his bicycle on the gravel road behind our house and split his chin open, and I drove 40 minutes to the emergency room in a snowstorm in June, because that's Sudbury, and sat with him while they put in 7 stitches, and he cried and held my hand the entire time and said, "Dad, don't leave. Don't leave, okay?" I hadn't left. He had. The clinic nurse, a woman named Denise who'd been doing this job long enough that she could read a person's face the way some people read weather, asked me if I needed anything when she came to disconnect the line. I said no. She looked at me the same way she'd looked at me 3 weeks ago when I'd arrived alone for the second time in a row. My wife passed 4 years ago. Denise knew that. The clinic knew a lot of things about me that my son didn't. I drove home slowly. My hands were steadier than they had any right to be. The October trees along Highway 17 had gone full color, the way they do up here. Not gently, not gradually, but all at once. Like they decided together that if they were going to burn, they might as well burn completely. I'd lived in this part of Ontario for 63 years, and it still stopped me sometimes. My daughter called before I got to the driveway. She lives in Sault Ste, 2 hours west. She works at the elementary school there, grade 3, and she coaches the girls' volleyball team on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and she has 2 kids of her own, a boy, 8, and a girl, 6, and her husband works shifts at the mill. They are not struggling, but they are not comfortable either. They are the kind of family that knows exactly what's in their account on any given Thursday. She said, "Dad, Billy from next door called me. He said you looked wrong when you came out of the clinic." I said I was fine. She said, "You're not fine, I can hear it. What happened?" I told her about the $2,400 and Friday and the call with my son. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm coming Saturday, don't argue with me." I said it's a 2-hour drive. She said, "I know how far away I live, Dad." I went inside and sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet the way a house gets quiet when someone who used to fill it isn't there anymore. My wife used to say this kitchen was the heart of the house. She was right. Now the heart of the house was just a table and a stack of medical bills and a fruit bowl with 2 oranges in it that I kept forgetting to eat. I called the hospital billing office. They offered me a payment plan, $800 a month for 3 months. I made $19,940 a month on my teacher's pension. I did the math. I couldn't do the math. I went to bed and didn't sleep. At 7 in the morning, my phone rang. It was Walt. Walt Kowalski had been a carpenter for 34 years. We'd been friends since 1987 when we both coached the Sudbury Wolves Minor Hockey Association and spent every Saturday morning in an arena that was always 10 degrees too cold drinking bad coffee and arguing about line changes. He retired 2 years before me. His wife Elaine made the best cabbage rolls in Northern Ontario, and they had a dog named Pierre who was 11 years old and moved like he knew something the rest of us didn't. Walt said, "I heard about the clinic." I said, "Word travels." He said, "Small city. Listen, some of the guys want to help." I said, "Walt." He said, "Don't start. Don't give me the speech. You've shown up for every one of us for 30 years. Gord's kid's funeral, Mike's bypass, my thing with the shoulder. You just show up, Jack. You don't even call ahead. You just appear with food or with your truck or with yourself, and you stay until things are a little less awful. So don't give me the speech about not accepting charity because this isn't charity. This is what people do." I didn't say anything. He said, "We took up a collection. 12 guys. I've got $900 in an envelope in my jacket right now." I said I couldn't take it. He said, "I'm dropping it off in an hour. If you're not home, I'm leaving it in the mailbox." An hour later, his truck was in the driveway. He handed me the envelope, squeezed my shoulder, said nothing else useful, and drove away. That was Walt. He'd been doing things like that for 30 years, and he never wanted to talk about it afterward. $900 in the envelope. Mostly 20s. $150 from Gord, who was on a fixed income himself and absolutely should not have put in $50. I sat at the kitchen table with the envelope in my hands for a long time. Saturday came. My daughter arrived at 10 in the morning, both kids in the back seat still in their hockey gear because there'd been practice at 7, and she'd driven straight from the arena. My grandson came through the door first and went directly to the cookie jar the way he always did, and my granddaughter hugged my legs and told me she'd lost another tooth, and here was the gap to prove it, and for about 4 minutes, the house was loud and full and the way it's supposed to be. When the kids were settled with the television, my daughter sat across from me at the kitchen table and put an envelope down between us. She said, "Don't." I said, "I haven't said anything yet." She said, "You're about to say you can't take it. I'm telling you ahead of time not to." I looked at the envelope. She said, "It's $1,200. I've been putting aside whatever I can since Mom died because I knew something like this would happen eventually. Not this exactly, but something. You're stubborn, and you live alone, and you don't ask for help, and I knew someday there would be a something." I said, "This is your emergency fund." She said, "You are the emergency dad." I didn't answer for a moment. She said, "He didn't call you back, did he?" I said, "He said he'd call this weekend." She looked at me. We both knew he hadn't called. She said, "He has a $4,000 espresso machine in his office. I saw it on Instagram. He posted a photo of it with a caption about investing in teen culture." I said, "I know." She said, $4,000 espresso machine. $2,400 is nothing to him. I said, "I know." She pushed the envelope toward me. "Take it, please." I took it. That afternoon, after the kids had run themselves into exhaustion and were asleep on the living room floor under the quilt, my wife made the winter before she died. My daughter and I sat in the kitchen, and I did the arithmetic on a piece of scrap paper. Walt's envelope, $1,900. Her envelope, $200. Her envelope, $200. My own account, $340 left after rent and utilities. Total, $2,440. $40 over. I called the billing office Monday morning and paid in full. I didn't hear from my son for 3 weeks. When he finally called, it was a Tuesday evening, and he sounded distracted and a little guilty, which is the combination that used to mean he'd forgotten to do his homework and was hoping I wouldn't ask about it. He said, "Dad, I've been meaning to call. Things have been insane. How are you feeling?" I said, "I finished my 3rd round of chemo last week." He said, "Oh good, that's good. So it's going well?" I said, "It's going." He said, "Look, I feel bad about the thing with the billing. The timing was what it was, but I should have found a way." I said, "Yes, you should have." Silence. He said, "Dad." I said, "Your sister drove 4 hours round trip with her 2 kids in the car to bring me money she'd been saving for 3 years. Walt Kowalski and 11 other men I coached hockey with put $900 in an envelope. You gave me a speech about shareholder agreements." He said, "That's not fair. It's complicated." I said, $2,400 isn't complicated. Helping your father stay alive isn't complicated." He said, "I know." I said, "I feel bad." I said, "Feeling bad and doing something are different things." He said he had to go. We hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a while after that, looking at nothing in particular. Then I called my old colleague Dennis, who taught history at my school for 28 years and had since gone back to school for his law degree, because Dennis was the kind of person who never stopped finding things interesting. He said, "You sound like something's happened." I said, "I need you to look into my son's company for me." A pause. He said, "What kind of looking into?" I said, "I want to understand what I'm dealing with. He's been asking me for years to co-sign things, to write reference letters, to put my name on paperwork. I always did it. I'd like to know what those things actually were." Dennis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Jack, I need to ask you something first." I said, "Ask." He said, "Are you doing this because you want information or because you want to cause damage?" I thought about that honestly. I said, "I want to know the truth. What I do with it after is a separate question." He said, "All right, give me 2 weeks." He called back in 11 days. He came to the house. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where my wife used to correct essays, and where my kids used to do homework, and where I had done 30 years' worth of the ordinary things that hold a life together. And he opened a manila folder. He said, "Your son is not in good shape financially." I said, "His company just raised." He said the Series B was $6 million Canadian. Of that, $4.1 million went directly to pay off bridge loans he took out in 2021 and 2022. His actual operating runway is about 8 months. The company has 17 employees and a burn rate that doesn't match the revenue projections he filed with his investors. I looked at the folder. Dennis said, "There's more. In 2021, you co-signed a line of credit for $35,000 from a credit union in Mississauga. Do you remember that?" I said, "He told me it was for equipment, for the office." Dennis slid a page across the table. I looked at it. The loan had been used to pay personal credit card debt. My son's personal credit card debt. The line of credit had gone to collections 8 months later. It was still on my credit report. It was the reason I'd been denied when I applied for a small personal loan the previous spring to fix the furnace. I said, "He told me he paid it off." Dennis said, "He told you a lot of things." I kept reading. There was a commercial lease in Barrie, a small office space that my son had signed in my name in 2020 without my knowledge. The landlord had pursued the debt. It had been settled eventually, but my name was attached to the judgment. There was a letter of reference I'd written for a partnership application in 2019 that had been altered, not dramatically, but enough. My words, rearranged. My signature, legitimate. The context, changed. Dennis sat quietly while I read. I said, "How much of what he's built is real?" Dennis said, "Some of it. The company exists. The product works. But the foundation it's sitting on, the way he got there, he cut corners on people. Not strangers necessarily. People who trusted him." I said, "Like me?" He said, "Like you." I sat with that for a while. Dennis said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to think about it." He left the folder. I drove to Sault Ste. that weekend. I didn't call ahead. I pulled into my daughter's driveway at noon on Saturday and she opened the door before I'd made it up the porch steps. And she said, "Dad, what happened?" I said, "Nothing's happened. I just needed to see you." She made tea. The kids were at their father's mother's house. We sat in her kitchen, smaller than mine, warmer somehow, and I put the folder on the table. I told her everything, the co-signed line of credit, the altered reference letter, the lease in Barrie with my name on it, the credit report, the furnace loan I hadn't been able to get. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "He did this while you were going through chemo." I said, "He did this before I was going through chemo." She put her hands flat on the table. Her hands looked like her mother's hands. I had to look away for a moment. She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know yet, but I needed you to know first." She nodded. I drove home Sunday morning. The trees were bare now, all that October color gone, just gray branches against gray sky. Northern Ontario in November. Everything stripped back to what it actually is. I called my son from the driveway. He answered on the fourth ring. I said, "I need you to meet me, not in Toronto, somewhere in the middle, Battery. Tim Hortons on Dunlop Street, Saturday, 10 in the morning." He said, "Dad, I have." I said, "Saturday, 10 o'clock. A pause. He said, "Okay." He was already there when I arrived, which told me he was nervous. My son is congenitally late to things he doesn't care about. He was sitting with a coffee he'd barely touched, and he looked like he hadn't been sleeping well, which was the first honest thing I'd seen from him in a long time. I sat down across from him. I didn't order anything. I put a single page on the table between us, the credit union statement, my name on the loan, the collections notice. He looked at it. His face went the color of old snow. He said, "Dad, I can explain." I said, "I'm not here for an explanation. I already know what happened." He said, "I was going to pay it back. I meant to." I said, "Stop, please." He stopped. I said, "I'm going to tell you what I know. Then you're going to listen, and when I'm finished, you can decide what kind of person you want to be." That's the only thing I'm interested in today. I told him what Dennis had found. All of it. The lease, the reference letter, the credit report, the furnace. I told him about sitting in the chemo chair with a billing notice in my pocket and calling him and listening to him explain shareholder agreements. I told him about Walt and the 12 men in the envelope of 20s. I told him about his sister driving 4 hours with her kids in hockey gear to put $12 and $12 on my kitchen table. He was crying before I finished. Not performance crying, the real kind, the kind that's ugly and involuntary, the kind you can't strategically deploy. I let him sit with it. Then I said, "I'm not going to the authorities. That's not what this is, but I need you to do 3 things, and they're not negotiable." He looked at me. I said, "First, the credit union debt is still technically on my credit report. You're going to contact them in writing this week and make arrangements to have it resolved properly and removed from my file. You're going to send me confirmation when it's done." He nodded. I said, "Second, your sister has been carrying this family since your mother died. Quietly, without being asked. Without being asked. Without complaining. Without posting about it on Instagram. You're going to set up an automatic transfer, monthly, whatever amount you can actually sustain, into an account for her kids' education. You're going to do this before the end of the month, and you're going to maintain it, not as a loan, not with conditions, because she earned it." He said, "Yes. Okay, yes." I said, "Third." He waited. I said, "I want you to come to Sudbury. Not for Christmas, not for an occasion. Just come. Drive up on a weekend when there's nothing happening, and sit in the kitchen with me and tell me the truth about how things actually are. Not the version for investors. The real one, because I think you've been drowning for a while, and I think you've been doing it alone, and I think that's part of how all of this happened." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "You're not, after everything I did, you're not cutting me off?" I said, "You're my son. That doesn't mean what you did is acceptable. It means I'm giving you the chance to become someone who wouldn't do it again. That chance has conditions. Those were the conditions." He said, "What if I don't fix it?" I said, "Then you don't, and we'll both know what that means." He said, "I'll fix it." I said, "I know." I drove home through the middle of Ontario, through towns that had been shrinking slowly for decades, to Canadian Shield country that had survived everything anyone had ever thrown at it. The landscape up here doesn't perform toughness. It just is tough, It's been that way since before anyone was watching. The credit union letter came 12 days later. Confirmation of resolution. My credit file updated within the month. The first transfer to my daughter's account appeared on the 28th. She called me when she saw it. She was very quiet on the phone for a moment, and then she said, "What did you say to him?" I said, "I told him the truth." She said, "That's all?" I said, "Truth is usually enough if you say it clearly and the other person is willing to hear it." My son came to Sudbury in January. He arrived on a Friday evening with his overnight bag and stood in my kitchen doorway looking like he wasn't sure he deserved to come in, which was probably accurate but wasn't the point. I made dinner. We sat at the table. He told me the truth about the company, about the debt, about the decisions he'd made when he was scared and convinced himself or wasn't hurting anyone. He told me about the moment, sitting in the parking lot of a coffee shop in Mississauga in 2021, when he signed my name on a document he had no right to, and told himself he'd fix it before I ever found out. He said, "I knew it was wrong when I did it. I did it anyway." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because I was ashamed of how bad things had gotten, and I didn't know how to ask you for help." I said, "So instead you took it." He said, "Yes." I said, "That was cowardice." He said, "I know." I said, "Telling me now is not cowardice." He looked up. I said, "I'm not saying it fixes anything. I'm saying there's a difference, and the difference matters." We did the dishes together after dinner, the way we used to when he was a teenager. He washed, I dried. Neither of us said much. The kitchen window was fogged from the cold outside and the warm inside, and a dog from next door barked twice in the distance. And it was ordinary in a way that felt, for the first time in a long time, like it might actually last. He came back in March. He brought his partner, a woman I'd heard about but never met. Calm, direct, someone who looked at him like she saw him clearly and had made a decision about that. I liked her immediately. She helped with dinner without being asked, and she talked to me about her own father, the way people talk about someone they're still grieving, which told me everything I needed to know about her. My fourth round of chemo finished in February. In April, the oncologist said the scans were looking better than expected. Better than expected was not the same as clear, but it was something. It was the kind of news that makes you want to call people, and I did call people. I called Walt, and I called Dennis, and I called my daughter, who cried. And then I sat in my kitchen for a while and let myself feel the particular relief of still being here. My son called that evening too. He'd already heard from his sister. He said, "Dad, I'm so glad." I said, "Me too." He said, "I'm sorry for all of it." I said, "I know you are." He said, "Is sorry enough?" I said, "It's a start. The rest is what you do next." There's a plaque on the wall at my old school, the one where I taught for 31 years, that I used to walk past every morning. It says something about the difference between intelligence and character, and how the second one is harder to teach. I used to think about that with my students. Some of them were brilliant and some of them were good, and the ones who were both were rare and worth everything. My son is smart. He always has been. Whether he becomes good, that's still being decided. I watch it happen slowly, in the transfers that come every month without being reminded, in the voice on the phone that stopped performing and started talking, in the way he sat at my kitchen table in January and told me the truth without cleaning it up first. You don't always get to know how the story ends. You're usually still living it when you think it's over. But I drove up to see my daughter last month, took the grandkids to the rink, watched my grandson fall down 17 times and get up 18. Watched my granddaughter tell him very seriously after each fall that he had to bend his knees more, that she'd told him this already, that she didn't know why he wasn't listening. Driving home on the 17, I rolled the window down even though it was cold. The air up here in spring smells like something opening, like something that had been closed a long time, deciding it was ready. 63 years in this part of the world and it still gets me. I'm still here. That's where I'll start. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the phone call with my son. Not the billing notice. Not even the January evening when he sat across from me and finally told the truth. It's Walt standing in my driveway in October rain, handing me an envelope of other people's 20s and driving away before I could finish saying thank you. He didn't want the thanks. That was the whole point. I've been thinking about what that moment actually means, and I think it comes down to something simple that took me 63 years to understand clearly. The choices we make when it costs us something are the only ones that really count. Anyone can be generous when it's convenient. Anyone can show up when the weather's good and the parking is easy. What reveals a person's character is what they do when showing up is inconvenient, expensive, and no one's watching. My son is smart. He always was. He built something real out of almost nothing, and that took a kind of intelligence I respect. But somewhere along the way, he confused cleverness with integrity, and those are not the same thing. Cleverness finds the loophole. Integrity doesn't look for one. He found every loophole available to him, in contracts, in credit applications, in the fine print of relationships. And he told himself it was just how things worked. That's what happens when you stop asking whether something is right and only ask whether it's legal. The two questions lead you to very different places. My daughter never had his advantages. She works harder than he does for a fraction of what he earns, and she has never once, not once, used that as a reason to withhold herself from the people she loves. She drove 4 hours in a car full of hockey gear because her father needed her. She gave money she'd been quietly saving for years because she understood, without being told, that love isn't a feeling you have privately. It's something you act on, out loud, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs you. That's the thing about how consequences actually work. They're not random, they're not luck. They accumulate quietly in the background, invisible until they aren't. Every time my son chose the shortcut, the workaround, the easier version of the truth, he was building something, not his company, but his character. And character compounds, the same way debt does. By the time I sat across from him in that Tim Hortons in Barrie, he'd been paying interest on years of small decisions for a long time. He just hadn't noticed the bill yet. What I hope he understood, sitting there, is that the path back isn't dramatic. It's not a single gesture or a big announcement. It's the monthly transfer that shows up without being reminded. It's the phone call where you tell the truth instead of the version you've rehearsed. It's showing up to Sudbury on a weekend when nothing is happening just because your father is there and time is not guaranteed. I'm still here. I don't know for how long, none of us do, and I've stopped pretending otherwise. But I'm still at my kitchen table, still watching the trees on Highway 17 go through their seasons, still driving to the Sault to watch my grandson fall down on the ice and get back up again. That stubbornness. That refusal to stay down. I taught him that. The same way someone taught it to me, the same way we teach everything that actually matters, not by saying it, but by doing it over and over until it becomes who you are.